And they kind of they take between like 3 to 5 grams, which is a lot. And for a lot of them, it is their first time. Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, I would not recommend for someone's
Yeah.
first time they take that
I
much.
would
Damn.
also personally not either.
I'm Yuki, joined by my co-host Reggie, and you're listening to Modern Day Hippie, the podcast about doing drugs in a responsible, fun, and safe way to improve your life. Before we jump into today's episode, a quick legal disclaimer. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Our goal is to educate and inform others about the realities of substance use in an engaging format. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to attempt to recreate anything found in this episode or any of our other content. We are not confessing to any acts stated in this podcast. The content in this episode should not be treated as factual or real in any way. Now, with that, we hope you enjoyed today's show. Ladies and gentlemen, I have with me today a very special guest of the podcast. He is the king, the master of drug-related meditation retreats, and he's done a lot of business and growth-related work for all kinds of companies in the psychedelic space. Right now, getting more into freelancing, which is awesome, something that I really heavily support. And it's my pleasure to introduce Pranab to the podcast.
Hey, Yuki, how's it going?
It's going well, man. Yeah, we've had this conversation teed up for a couple of weeks now, and we actually have known each other for a while now. But I only learned recently that you've been working in the space for a few years now. And so it's really exciting to me that we've both kind of independently arrived at what seem like pretty similar conclusions, but in very different ways. And it's really amazing that you're building your career in this space. So excited to hear more about that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I can give a bit of an intro. I studied chemical engineering in my undergrad and kind of pivoted my way into growth marketing in software companies. And pretty quickly soon after I got my first software job or job at a software company and moved to San Francisco, I got quite into the whole mental health space a lot more. I went from reading Paul Graham's startup essays to like mental health stuff and watching Michael Pollan on Joe Rogan and kind of understanding that whole dive into everything. I've been a meditator for a few years, and basically around the same time I got deeper into meditation and Buddhism, I also got more into psychedelics and like psilocybin mushrooms and understanding the impact they had on therapy and all that stuff.
Dude, that's such an interesting correlation because I literally had the same kind of parallel experiences where as I got, I think, deeper into psychedelics and understanding drugs from a very like productive and practical perspective was when I got more serious about meditation, exploring like my feelings around Buddhism and things like that. I feel like that's a topic for another time. Like there's so much that goes into that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think there's a bunch of like quote unquote like pipelines into this stuff. Like for some people, they come at it from like the party scene, which is totally fine. Some people come at it from like the productivity scene, and like which is totally fine. And then if you look at the '60s, all the biggest meditation teachers that emerged from there, like I'm not exactly sure, but I think like Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein, they all had some experience, like especially Ram Dass, they all had some experience with psychedelics in the 60s that then turned into like meditation and Buddhist instruction. So that's a whole other pathway. So there's like a ton of parallels and a lot of interesting ways they intersect that I think still aren't super emphasized.
Yeah, I wondered to what extent the journeys of those mentors and teachers was spurred on by kind of the like government's very like anti-psychedelic campaign that they took from, it was crazy to me learning. I think a couple of weeks ago, I was doing research on what that process was like. And it's just like, we are just working to claw our way back in terms of the legality and getting past the stigmas around these substances, like back to where we were freaking like 60, 70 years ago.
Totally. Yeah, my like layperson understanding of like the research space is like this was all there, and now we're just kind of going through studies just to make it kind of validated as here are the effects. The side effect of that is that we are also like researchers are a lot more careful, and a lot of the people who are deepest into the research are also kind of in some ways not anti-psychedelics, but just like really into psychedelic safety and understanding how to avoid kind of the consequences of the 70s, 60s, and 70s.
Right.
So that's interesting. But yeah, like basically when stuff kind of went illegal people either just went underground, aka just like not public about their work. A lot of like there were some researchers like Stan Groff that went into breath work and tried to like simulate psychedelic effects through breathing. This guy named I think John C. Wiley went into sensory deprivation tanks. So if you like see all those around wherever you are, that's the result of someone trying to like emulate psychedelic effects through just like pure sensory deprivation, which is just so fascinating because it does work, honestly.
Dude, it's so funny you mentioned that because I had my first like really insane breathwork experience like a month ago now. And
Nice.
truly, I have never felt that way without the aid of some sort of substance.
Yeah.
It was pretty fucking nuts, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I haven't personally like gotten too deep into it, but like you shared, I think it's like it's a real thing. It's like so much a real thing. It's crazy what can happen from just the breath.
Yeah. I think we really chronically underestimate like what we have control over doing with our bodies. I think it's a matter of just channeling that. And that's something that I've been trying to unlock through like meditation and a daily practice there. And admittedly, I'm still very early in that journey, even though I've been doing it for several months now. That's something where it just takes so much kind of like mastery over your mind and your senses that I feel like every 1 out of 10 times I'll kind of get a glimpse of like, oh, I felt like really particularly good in that, like 5 minute or however long session. And then the other 9 out of 10, like I'll feel like I'm trying, but I'm just not quite there. Like I've glimpsed it.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to work towards being more consistent with
whatever
that feeling
for
was.
sure. Yeah. And if you look, there's like a bunch of people on YouTube like that have kind of popularized it, like Frank Yang on YouTube, who's like a fitness dude who's like got way into meditation. Like there's like so much stuff on the meditation deep end that are just crazy that we're finally starting to kind of, well, people have understood for a long time, but it's becoming more popularized and spread. Basically like the importance of like the view you take and also the technique you do. Like you could do like one person can meditate for 10 years and use like a headspace, like an app or something. And it's fine. It's great. And then like another person can just like read, like maybe not even meditate for like 9 years, but like listen to a ton of talks and know a bunch of the theory and know the deep end. And that last year just meditate a bunch and actually might get like quote unquote more progress.
Really?
I mean, that's kind of like an extreme and probably not exactly true, but that's like, I think that's something that I kind of like emphasizing to people. Like there is a bit of a theory aspect to it / like instructional aspect that I think it's just really interesting. Like there's a bunch of altered states and like really cool stuff for meditation that can happen that, is out there if you look for it.
Yeah, actually, I have kind of a collection of friends who have had very across the board experiences with meditation. And these are people who some of them stuck with it for a couple of years and felt like they weren't getting much out of it. And it's really interesting that you bring up that it might not just be a matter of like practice makes perfect, which I feel like can apply to so many things in life. But obviously you need some baseline of theory of knowing what goes into it. And like even for me in my practice, I very much started through the apps, the Headspace and the Calm, realized I didn't like the audios as much. I was like, can I just do it in silence? And then more recently started exploring a Zen Buddhist center in my city and kind of getting their take on it. And again, still like learning what the differences are there, but it's really fascinating, especially as I've read more books on the topic. Like this practice has truly been around longer than most religions, most like things in human history. And there's just been so many angles in which people have tried to tap into it. So yeah, I definitely feel you on the fact that there's such both a depth and a breadth of knowledge that like I have no fucking clue what I know and what I don't know about it.
Yeah, like some interesting stuff where psychedelics and meditation intersect. I think just the topic of like non-duality or kind of this like whole field of stuff called non-duality, which is like my one sentence explanation that's not going to do it justice. It's like life without concept or like living life without like kind of the confines of concept is how you see things. Anyways, that just sounds kind of abstract, but like there's like actual like brain differences you can study that kind of indicate this kind of stuff. And that's pretty interesting on the intersection. And some stuff that like you probably can only get in meditation. There's this phenomena called cessation, where you literally can like some like really advanced Vipassana meditators can actually just shut down more or less their conscious experience. Like literally just like a pop. And they're like, they're not asleep. It's just like a gap in conscious experience. But the point of it is that when you get out of it, you're actually like so insanely refreshed and rested more than you've ever experienced. It's like you only know it happened because of what happens afterwards. So it's kind of like sleep in that way, but it's really interesting. So that can happen for like a second or 2 seconds. But there's a paper that came out from like some pretty reputable researchers that are at the intersection of like neuroscience, psychedelia, meditation, that have studied this phenomena called Nirodha Samapati, which is kind of like, it sounds like some crazy thing, but it's like people that can hold cessation for like minutes to like hours at a time. And they did a study where they hooked up this person who could do it repeatedly to an EEG machine and actually saw like brain activity just like flatlined for like
Wow.
a few minutes and just came back. And it wasn't exactly controllable, but he could influence it and intend on it. So that's like sick. And that's like the kind of stuff that once there's more research and like stuff's out there, people will be like, wait, that's possible? That's even like within the realm of something that someone can train themselves to do.
Yeah, it just goes so contrary to like what we believe is possible with the human body from a medical perspective. And that reminds me of, I think I've seen like mini documentaries or videos about Buddhist monks that can regulate their body temperature like throughout different parts of their body. They're like, all right, now I'm going to make like my arms like super cold, and they'll literally have it on like a thermal scanner. And it's fucking nuts. Like, it's like on one hand, it's like no one thought that should be possible, and it like doesn't really make sense.
Yep.
But on the other hand, it's like we are, in theory, should have pretty full control of our bodies. It's just at different levels of access that we would be able to do that.
Totally. Yeah, it's pretty nutty. I think like stuff like chi and prana and like chakras, I used to think all that was like crazy, and it doesn't still exactly make sense from like scientific organ point of view for me necessarily, but it, like from like a within it system, it makes sense. And the fact that it can accurately predict / like talk about some of this phenomena that's kind of under talked about is pretty interesting. And yeah, there's like legit people that can like, yeah, like you said, regulate certain parts of their body. There's like the coal walkers in India. That's kind of like one common thing. And
right.
Tibetan monks, there's a thing called tumo practice where you can just like, you're really cold, but yeah, it's like a type of breath work. You can just like really heat up your body. And like, there's some reports that like steam can come out of their head in the middle of the cold or something. Dude, I don't know.
What the fuck?
Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff.
Man, that's incredible. Okay, this is cool. This is a really good start to the conversation.
Yeah.
And I wanted to take things into specifically your experiences with different types of drug-related retreats, because I know you've had one experience where you're actually a participant in one of these retreats, and one where you're actually more of an organizer and you're helping operate it and kind of being behind the scenes of these other people's experiences. So I would love to start off with like, first, how did you end up going to one of these retreats? Like, how did you do your research? How'd you find out about it? What made you pull the trigger? And then like walk me through that process.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I sometimes get a feel that I'm really not a psychonaut. I honestly don't even do that many psychedelics. Like probably like less than 10 in my lifetime for like macro trips. But it's almost like I just like really enjoy talking to people about them and just like learning about them, almost just from like a knowledge point of view, and just seeing how like helpful they can be clinically. Both from the pros and cons and seeing who they're for and not. So I think it's just really cool from like a thing that exists kind of point of view. So, and I also just enjoy talking to people who are into the space and even outside of psychedelics, just do interesting things with their lives. So I reached out to a guy who's now a close friend, who started this company called Opmon Retreat. And they're one of the first retreat companies in Jamaica that do psilocybin retreats. Psilocybin mushrooms are legal in Jamaica, and yeah, he started this company, I think in like 2017 or 2019. His name is Aaron.
Sorry, they're legal?
They are legal, like completely legal. Yeah, and the Jamaica as a country has kind of put investment behind it for tourism purposes, and also like allowing for research partnerships between U.S.-based like drug R&D producers and their kind of research universities. And there's a whole kind of industry now flourishing because of it. And yeah, so.
And are there like dispensaries in Jamaica, or like how accessible?
Yeah,
is it to
I would say to the general
there?
public, probably not so much. It's legal because it's not illegal.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, it's not exactly like it's not consumer friendly, and I didn't really get to explore much when I was there, but it doesn't seem like it was like super around. I'm sure it probably was, but it's kind of a weird cultural thing too, where it's like it's not illegal because just people there just didn't really know much about it. So it's like kind of like a cultural transplant. That's like a whole another thing too. But yeah, there are a bunch of retreat companies in Jamaica, like at least 10 at this point, 10 to 15, I'm sure.
Wow.
Yeah. So we kind of became friends, and around 2020 or 2021, I started doing some freelancing stuff in my career. And one of the things I was doing was helping him with the retreat company, plus like another startup in the legal ketamine space in the US that he was working on. And yeah, long story short, I just kind of was helping with some of the marketing and the retreat operations. Like, hey, even Jamaican mushroom retreat companies need Salesforce. So I was kind of helping them kind of manage all that.
Yeah, the rails that the world runs on, whether you're a tech company
right?
or not.
And and then when COVID stuff kind of got more chill with vaccines, he restarted retreats in September of 2021. And I got to go there. I wasn't a facilitator or a guide, but I was kind of just like an operations person supporting the therapists that were there doing the mushroom ceremony. And it was life-changing even for me to see, like without actually taking anything. I'm happy to talk more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear more about what that experience was like. I mean, my, very limited knowledge about retreats is purely people telling me a little bit about like their ayahuasca experience in Peru and things like that. Like very curious how it was with something like mushrooms, which is a substance that I'd say I'm like extremely familiar with, but have never taken in kind of a controlled or guided setting like that. It's always been self-administered, recreational.
It's wild. Like I feel like, a common adage or adage in the whole space is set and setting. And I think I would add a few more to it, like set, setting, skill, substance, dosage, basically a bunch of other things too. But more or less, it really did make a difference. Like the container that it was in. The container is kind of like, in some ways, it's a bit of a nebulous word. Like I didn't really understand it, but it really is like when you're in a new environment and you're there, these are people that are not exactly people you would think would take psychedelics, but it kind of makes sense. Like they're, typically like you think like younger, maybe exploratory, but these are actually a lot of them were older people, later in their careers, maybe near retirement. And they came because it was legal, it was safe, it's reputable, it's trustworthy. And a lot of them came because they like looking for a real thing to solve. And to fly to a new country to do this, you have to be quite thoughtful and essentially kind of it's a 4-day retreat. Day 1, they arrive, do kind of getting used to the group and getting kind of acculturated. Day 2 is the actual ceremony day, which we can talk in more detail about.
Okay.
Day 3 is an integration day where they kind of process what happened. And day 4 was like closing and leaving. And it really did make a big difference. And other retreats are structured differently. Some include multiple ceremonies. Some are like a bit more luxurious. It just depends, right? Depending on how much they want the cost to be and all that.
Right.
But it's legit. It's wild. It's like people come in and they leave like a real change from the issues they had, at least from what I saw. And then like we kind of did post surveys and there's a whole process. Like there's like an application process or screening to make sure that people with severe trauma aren't able to come, which unfortunately just in a group setting, you can't really have like really intense stuff like that come up, or you can, but you just have to have precautions around it and guardrails. There's like some pre-integration with some of the therapists and so there's a whole process and there's a whole thing and it really does work.
Man. Okay. So what is the day of the ceremony?
Yeah.
Like? And, from like kicking off that experience and obviously to the extent that you can speak, like, I don't know how much of this is something that, on Modern Retreat keeps like something that's fairly proprietary to them. And then, how are people reacting? Because I imagine for a lot of these people, it's their first time with like any sort of psychoactive.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the day of the retreat, it's, you get good rest. So speaking generally as well, a lot of retreats, there's this kind of like the way that they prime you, just retreats in general, to kind of be more open to the experience and have more change. There are quite a few ways they do it. One is diet, like kind of, recommending like a more vegetarian diet or plant-based or just something with more greens and vegetables that feels lighter on the body and less heavy. Like, I think it's like, it's fine to have like a big greasy pizza and a burger right before, but like, in my experience, it's not a huge deal, but I think for these, right.
Dude, yeah, in my experience, it can make a big difference. Right. You better watch that.
So like all this stuff adds up, right? Like they try to abstain from alcohol and drugs, and a friend of mine went to an ayahuasca retreat recently in South America, and they had a pretty like intense recommendation beforehand, like 2 or 3 weeks of like no spices and like basically just like a paleo vegan diet with some fish, not even salt, like all this stuff. So, but all of it is almost like you're kind of training your brain, like you're really preparing for it. You're putting effort, you're putting intention, you're thinking about it like for days before with a lot of depth.
Yeah. And even that really helps establish that frame going into the experience. Like the fact that it seems like it really begins, anywhere from a few days to a few weeks before you even get on that flight.
Yep. In a lot of ways that like amplifies what it'll be like, because you're just like, you're already amping it up. Like one way of looking at psychedelics that I've heard some researchers talk about, they're a non-specific amplifier. So sometimes they're actually kind of like a more positively valenced amplifier. So like it amps up good stuff, but they just
Mhm.
amplify everything, right? So you can kind of do
Right.
things to already kind of increase your sensory clarity and attunement to stuff, like with diet, good exercise, good sleep, all that. So yeah, you do a bunch of that before the retreat. During the retreat, vegetarian meals, some light movement and breath work and kind of meditation in the morning. Get ready, you do journal with your intentions. And then, the ceremony starts. Well, the ceremony has like a preparation, and every therapist or guide has their own take on it. But they get into it, and usually there's some music playing, and they kind of just they take between like 3 to 5 grams, which is a lot. And for a lot of them, it is their first time. Yeah,
Wow.
yes, it.
Yeah, I would not recommend for someone's
Yeah,
first time they take that
I
much.
would
Damn.
also personally not either, and I also kind of had I think like a bit of caution against the group experience. But I actually, coming away from the experience, realized how helpful it is when it's guided, when there's a structure, when there's safety, and there's a container.
Mhm.
Those things actually become like more likely to be helpful than not, especially after the screening
Okay.
and everything, right? So yeah, everyone had positive experience, and no one had adverse. This is a super small sample size, so I'm not saying this is how it is for all retreats, but
Right.
yeah,
Of
no
course.
like
Of course.
adverse negative experiences during it, no like terrible trips or bad trips or anything. Some people were a little unpleasant, had some
Right.
crying going on, which can be normal,
Yeah.
but they
Yeah.
processed it really well afterwards. And yeah, it's wild to just see, like, it is a lot, but then afterwards looking back, so then, a few hours pass and they're all doing their own thing. Like one guy's dancing, one person's kind of just chilling.
Hold on. The whole time, are they all in like one room? Are they allowed to like go outside? Like, what's the kind of structure? Like, what are like the rules in
Yeah,
place
it's all
around
like
that?
in one gymnasium type area. I
Okay.
think some retreats allow for outside, some don't. Like I think I've heard some ayahuasca retreat stories where they're like all in one hut and they can't leave. Like I think Noah
Right.
Kagan has like his whole story that there are a bunch of people with their reports. I think typically just for safety reasons you should all be in like eyesight of the facilitators. Yeah, and then like maybe on the come down you can go for a walk or something. But yeah, it's a pretty wild stuff. But a lot of them are processing some pretty intense things. Or sometimes, especially on that high of dosage, there can be some throw up and purging, which I clean up, which is fine. Yeah,
Oh man, yeah, man, we did say you were doing
operations.
the back office operations
Exactly,
work.
exactly. But yeah. So I mean that all happens, and then the real, that's all pretty quiet and internal. And then afterwards, they've gone through a really intense journey. And in the post trip
Right.
processing, like people are talking about it slowly, they're journaling, they're kind of taking walks, they're thinking about how to talk about it, and yeah, a lot has happened internally. A lot of reframes, a lot of shifts, and in the shares, like some of the issues range from grief to like past alcoholism to the relationship with their sometimes elderly or even deceased parents, and all this kind of stuff. And it's pretty wild to see how stuff can change from all that.
And would you say, what's the split of that reflection between them kind of inwardly reflecting, journaling, thinking, versus them outwardly sharing it with the group and kind of getting that like group empathy and maybe those other like shared
Yeah.
experiences that other people might have had that was
People
similar?
in our service, so people have shared like the group environment, at least anecdotally, really helped. This is not like an RCT, and like I
Hmm.
can't really compare like how group. I'm not sure of any studies that have compared group to individual. They might be out there, which I'd be curious to read, but at least anecdotally from this one experience, people said they really enjoyed the communal aspect. And I personally, it kind of opened me up to the fact that like, yeah, actually there can be like a really good thing from doing it with people in like a safe environment. And yeah, there's probably some stuff they don't fully process in a group because it's between them and their therapist, or even just between them themselves, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, wild to see. Super wild to see.
You're at the club and the music is thumping, but you've got nothing left in the tank. So what do? Sniff some cacao. Yup, you heard that right. Sniff some cacao. It's the hottest new trend in the club and party scene. One bum-sized sniff of raw chocolatey powder contains the caffeine equivalent to a half cup of coffee, and boom, it hits instantly. And the best part is you can now sniff cacao anytime, anywhere. Right out in the open, in front of the DJ booth or the stage, even at the VIP table with your friends. Now, how does that happen without drawing unwanted attention? Snowgo's spring-loaded bump straws make it possible. These classy, triple mirror polished bump straws are the safest, most discreet way to enjoy sniffing cacao. In fact, you've most likely already seen people wearing Snowgo's bump straws as pendants around their necks without even knowing it. Discover why sniffing cacao using Snowgo bump straws is being called the biggest revolution in partying since the invention of rock and roll. Jump on over to snowgostraws.com to learn more. That's SNOGOSTRAWS.com and use discount code MDH15 at checkout for 15% off your entire order. That honestly sounds like one of the more like beautiful things that you could see, just kind of like this group going through this very cathartic
Yeah,
experience together. And I'm very much in the same mindset where I think I have a little bit of a negative like preconceived notion about doing it in a group setting. But I mean, yeah, when you're doing something together, when you feel like you're not
for
alone,
sure.
especially I think if everyone in the group, like they have been screened and to an extent, it's like, okay, we think these people will kind of get along to an extent or
Yeah,
like be on the same level of just like what they're dealing with and going through.
yeah.
Could see that being a very like supportive environment.
Yeah, yeah, and it's wild because yeah, it really, I mean, there's a range, and it kind of really made me appreciate the range of like what role, like as Oregon has legalized psilocybin mushroom therapy, Colorado is on the cusp of legalizing it, or they've decriminalized it now. They're getting provisions in for legalizing it. Like, what is the role of someone else in this whole thing? Because it's kind of like you could just take these on your own, or you could pay someone a couple $1,000s to do this with you, and like what are you actually getting for that? That's a really interesting question, and I've kind of seen there's a
Right.
range of services. There's like base, like there's like trip sitting, facilitating, and guiding. I would say those are kind of the three levels that I've seen. Trip
Okay.
sitting, it's like a friend can do it for another friend, and that's where you're just kind of you're just there to make sure they're physically safe, maybe even out of the room, possibly not even just like really watching them a lot of the whole time, but just a friend that they can go to. It's like, hey, I'm having a hard time. You can kind of like talk them through it, or just get them water, or get them food, or something. And that I think is like just
Right.
good safety protocol in general for anyone doing psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah. Always.
And then like facilitator is I feel like a friend could be a facilitator, but I mean it's probably better if it's a separate person. But they're kind of like facilitator and guide. It kind of gets a little murky, but you're kind of as a facilitator, you're kind of
Mhm.
you may have met with them before. Hey, like what are your intentions? What are your kind of goals for this? What are you trying to get out of it? And then maybe even like potentially get them back on course if they seem to be kind of off of it. But it's still ultimately them doing it. And a
Okay.
guide, it's almost like, especially if you're taking like what's called a psycholytic dose, where you can still talk and be fluid, you're almost like trying to do therapy most of the time that's happening with like periods of them just doing their own thing because like it's maybe more intense. So it's like there's like a whole range of stuff that can happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I really like the way that you broke it down. And it's also a range from like pretty informal to increasingly
Yeah.
formal. Like that facilitator role is someone who's like, consciously playing that role. And then the guide reminded me of a lot of what I've seen and heard and read about pairing substances with talk therapy
Yeah.
and, having like two therapists in the room with you and walking you through like one of these experiences as you are also, I think talking about whatever you're intending to work on.
Yeah, from like a clinical side, it's interesting because like all this stuff, like what should be medicalized. In the U.S., there's kind of like there's essentially going to be like a 2-tier system. There's going to be like as psychedelics gets more cultural recognition and like legal recognition, there will be a medical model, and that's going to be figured out, and it's going
Right.
to be like way more conservative, and it has to like fit with insurance billing codes and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And like
Yep.
it'll be crazy expensive to start, and maybe it'll get better, but that's how it is. But then at the same time, especially with decrim laws, there's been a thriving underground therapy scene that just might get more legitimacy. That probably will get more legitimacy, where stuff can be more tested. There can be more experimentation. It probably will be a bit riskier, right? Because there aren't these legal safeguards in place. But hopefully cheaper, maybe like different ranges of experience, and then eventually that stuff gets like exported like to the legal space.
Right. Yeah. That's a very like helpful insight. And from what I've seen about especially the more like medical approach to it, is you have companies like Compass Pathways that are like trying to patent just the process of doing talk therapy under psilocybin, which is like kind of ridiculous. Like, yes, as a business, obviously you're trying to get like ownership of that, but that doesn't seem like it's a move for the greater good. And like the cost estimates I've seen of how much it would cost someone to go through a therapy like this in a medical setting is like tens of thousands of dollars. And who knows how long it's going to take for insurance companies to, actually be willing to cover something like this, which is probably going to be considered extremely experimental for like years to come.
100%. Yeah, a couple. I'll just put a couple plugs in. Check out headlineshq.substack.com or something like that. Headlines is a great newsletter that goes through the kind of news and trends and kind of a little bit of analysis on stuff going on. And another one called The Trip Report by Beckley Waves, also a great newsletter. But like Headlines, for example, recently covered that. Like last week, the American Medical Association released like billing codes for psychedelic therapy. So
Oh, nice.
so there's like a little tiny precedent that still needs a bunch of work on
Right.
it. and then there's also like some analysis done from maybe another newsletter that I'm forgetting now, but basically how like even once so MDMA therapy is probably like the farthest along with the FDA,
Mhm.
but even then, like with how drug scheduling laws work, it totally could be that like they like patent MDMA into like a certain name, and that is what's off Schedule 1, but then MDMA itself is still Schedule 1. So there's so many
Right.
things that could happen that are kind of like honestly kind of confusing and just like really weird about the whole thing. So it's even though there's like so much hype and so much like momentum and things going on, and it will make a big change in like the 10-20 year horizon. In the next
Yeah.
couple of years, it's still kind of a mystery like how this will all play out, like per state, nationally. Australia is like recently like nationally legalized it, but it's like very, very strict.
Mhm.
Canada is super interesting because like their whole decrim thing is like way
Yeah.
more lenient. So like if you go to Vancouver or Toronto, you'll see, especially in Vancouver, every like street corner you'll see a flyer for some random psychedelic stuff. It's
Oh my
wild.
God. Dude, yeah, I have a friend who lives in Montreal and he tells me that the gas station down the street from his house, he can buy like golden teacher mushrooms and
No
stuff. I'm like,
way.
that's
Oh,
wild,
that's
man. What the
crazy.
hell?
Yeah, it's
Yeah, I'm like,
crazy. It's just
I
so different.
wish.
Dude, right? It's super different. Super, super different.
Well, hopefully Canada leads the way on this one and the US gets some inspiration from there.
Right.
All right. Well, speaking of MDMA, I know your other retreat experience that you had was actually going on a MDMA specific retreat. And that's like completely new concept to me. Like I've heard of psychedelic retreats and I've heard of ketamine assisted therapy.
Yeah.
But MDMA is probably the vertical that I know the least about. So would love to hear the story around like
Yeah.
how you decided like that was the retreat that you wanted to go to and what your experience there was like.
Yeah, it's wild. So weird. Interestingly enough, so I've only had MDMA like 3 times in my life, and but two of those have been the most like meaningful, like impactful days of my life. And it's like it's so weird that it's still kind of in a weird way not talked about as much in psychedelic culture. Probably because MDMA is it's typically like a rave and party thing, which is great. I think it can be awesome for that. And but just for me in the way that like it's just like it's already you see it with the FDA like how it's on track for so MDMA assisted psychotherapy is on track for like PTSD healing and all that. And then separately, it's good to know that like all this stuff, we're just kind of assigning these labels to it to see like, oh, it's good for PTSD, it's good for depression, it's good for anxiety. But really they can like, why? Like what's the mechanism behind all of it that helps that allows them to be helpful for a bunch of things? And I think it's because it can, from like a clinical point of view, it kind of like, it can really just bring a sense of safety and trust that allows you to like put your protective mechanisms and defense mechanisms on less guard, which is
Mhm.
both amazing and can be pretty scary. Amazing because then that allows you to actually like see parts of yourself, these like exiles or these like hurt parts of you that have been gone away for a long time and heal them with kind of like a loving touch and loving presence. That's like on the positive side. On the negative side, it can be like too much too fast and like it can be kind of intense and you might get some
Right.
backlash. And that's on the healing side, but on the thriving, like feel amazing side, like it was like the most like me I've ever felt. It felt like super safe, super abundant. I just felt like all this like deep wisdom that I've never felt before. And I'm like, oh,
Dude.
this is like who I
Yeah.
can be if I just like, yeah, it's nuts. It's like, it makes me warm thinking about it.
No, truly. Yeah. I had a friend who described it really well that when she's taking MDMA, she feels like the truest version of herself. Like
Right.
she's like, I feel the most like me I have ever felt. And I very much empathize with that. Like it's a feeling that is very different from any other like substance that I've had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's
it's
it's extremely memorable.
yeah, and it's great, and at the same time, it's like it's also not perfect because there's potential neurotoxicity, and there's some research on pros and on like both sides of like is that really real or not. But you definitely don't want to take it every day. That'd probably mess you up quite
No.
a bit.
Yeah, definitely not.
And honestly, I think like some estimates like probably like 3 to 6 times a year is probably like the most. And I read some anecdote like for some person it's maybe like 20 times in a lifetime or I don't know. It depends, right? We're kind of figuring it all out. And there are a couple of
Yeah.
companies, one called Tactogen, one called Arcadia Medicine, that are actually trying to like research a non-neurotoxic MDMA or even like a
Mm,
microdosable MDMA that actually could be
wow.
like, yeah. So that's all like totally in the research phase and stuff. But anyways, yeah, I say all that to say it's been very impactful for me. And I think like even I find it important, even from a narrative point of view, to talk about it so people know that it's a possibility and not
Right.
necessarily to overhype it because, there's always these pitfalls. And if you look up Sasha Chapin, he wrote a couple of really good articles about this. And there are a few other interesting MDMA therapy articles that I really appreciate and admire. But yeah, in September I did like a meditation MDMA retreat, and in general I'm like super bullish on like more meditation retreats and more retreats at the intersection of both because I think they're super complementary. But yeah, happy to talk more about it.
Yeah, walk me through like, similarly how you talked about the process for the retreat in Jamaica. Was there any preparation beforehand? What was the structure like during it? And what do you feel like you were supposed to get out of it? What did you get out of it?
Yeah, so the details of it I'll keep somewhat general, but
Sure.
it's just organized with some friends, and yeah, it was just a few of us, and leading. So the intention of it was really just like a few days of meditation. There's a certain type of meditation called loving kindness meditation, and it's also called metta in Buddhist Pali. So metta meditation or loving kindness is really just about like becoming like a good friend to yourself and doing all that. So that was the intention of the retreat. So I did a bunch of like restful, what's called awareness type practice, which comes from Tibetan Buddhism. So leading up to the retreat, I had some intentions, but it was 3 or 4 days of doing meditation. We kind of cooked healthy meals together. It was lots of nature around, so just kind of enjoyed, talked. And it was mostly silent. So I think the silent aspect of it really kind of hones your sensory experience. But it wasn't like there's like a couple levels of meditation retreat. There's kind of like the yoga retreat where you're just like chilling and enjoying yourself. It's like a vacation. This was kind of in the middle where it's like, you're taking what's called a vow of silence and trying to follow. In Buddhism, there's called the precepts. So like kind of abstaining from meat and other types of things. But yeah. So you're kind of just like doing this really intentional thing and going inward. And I meditated maybe like 3 to 6 hours a day with some walking and stuff in between. Listen to guided meditations and talks in between. There's like another level to it which you could do that more like serious, like more intense retreats do, which is like you don't look at anybody. You're not even supposed to make eye contact.
Right.
That's like a whole nother level. But thankfully it wasn't like that. It was like nice and warm. But yeah, did a lot of meditation, listened to a bunch of talks. That was like for 3 or 4 days. Then I think it was the 4th or 5th day, we each did a solo MDMA journey in our rooms. And that was, I did like a small amount with the booster, and I just journaled for 6 hours straight. And on the come up for that, I did this type of therapy called IFS, internal family systems, with myself. So I kind of just like did some journaling with that style, had a lot of stuff come up and release. And I just processed a ton of stuff, a lot of like clarity on things in my life. And it just really, really helped. Lots of interesting insights. Wow. And yeah, and that was, and then, it ended and it was pretty chill. And the next, no one really had a come down or too bad of a come down. I think having the right supplementation and good quality stuff can really help with that. But yeah, the next day was kind of like a processing day. And the day after that, we all left. But it was amazing, just super life-changing. I think having like 4 or 5 days of meditation where even that morning, I just felt high from the meditation of just like feeling so good about life and everything. And yeah, and then going into like a journey experience like that from that state just makes it so good and just like very positive. You have a lot of equanimity to like handle whatever comes, and you can just kind of like get really deep.
Dude, it sounds like an incredible experience. It sounds like, was it something that you and the group you did it with, did you kind of like self-administer and kind of build that like schedule and curriculum for yourselves beforehand?
Yeah, exactly. So there was no like top down. It was kind of like, okay, what's the schedule? What do we want to do? How do we do this? So it was very like peer led, which comes, I think, because people there had experience with doing this kind of thing. First time, like with retreats in general, first time of us trying this experiment of like meditation and MDMA, but yeah, really helpful. And I think like I'm pretty bullish on more like generally smart, like discerning people doing this kind of stuff with themselves in like safe environments. Because I think like, it's the cheapest you can get it. It's like with good friends, you kind of, it's kind of a nice thing to do. I have some other friends who like organize like couples retreat with themselves and other friends and group bonding experiences. And I think like all this stuff is, I think, going to be pretty cool, especially as decrim and all that continues.
Yeah, I can definitely see it growing. And even how you describe, there's kind of these like subsets of this like industry, or it's like friend groups, it's like couples retreats. And I can imagine there being like very specific kind of approaches and curriculums for people that, groups that are all maybe going through something very similar in terms of what they're trying to get out of one of these retreats.
I could totally see like co-founder retreats, like co-founder counseling retreats or something. It's like you're resolving your difficulties. And I mean, what's wild is I think like a year or two ago, I saw that the Johns Hopkins MBA program, like in their newsletter, they advertise like a psilocybin retreat in the Netherlands where it's also legal. So it's like it's going to enter like the business world, the startup world at some point. Like it's already there.
Yeah, I feel like it's more deeply entrenched in that world than most people realize.
Yeah, I mean, like, hey, like Steve Jobs credits LSD with a bunch of his insights and everything. And
Yep.
yeah, and again, I think like it's probably also the time to like talk about like in general where we are and as a culture, it's like good to talk about safety and all that stuff. But like it's helpful to at least not like to cover it up under the dirt of like these are just random things that don't have any use. Like they clearly have a use. They clearly have a place in society.
Yeah, I could not agree more, man. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. This has been an incredible conversation. I learned a ton, and I'm sure people listening did as well. Where can people find you, keep up with you, etc.?
Yeah, bro. I would say probably just my Twitter for now, twitter.com/no Pranablem. That's my name, Pranab, LEM. I might change it at some point, but it's a good pun. It's kind of funny. And
I'm a fan.
Thanks, man. Oh yeah, Twitter. If you look it up on YouTube and Substack, there's stuff there, but it's not too popular yet. But yeah, hoping to put more content out there and more media and publications and stuff.
Cool, man. Well, happy to chat about that with you anytime because it's a great time and it's a grind and it's a lot.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, man. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the pod, and thank you everyone for listening. That's today's pod. Truly, thank you for listening to the show. We seriously fucking appreciate it. If you want to help us out, just leaving a rating or a comment, you know the drill, would be incredibly helpful. But more importantly, share the knowledge and the love with your friends. Make sure they're getting the information they need on this topic that is so underserved and underappreciated in today's society. We'll see y'all next week.